somewhere beneath the waters of a world we think we know, there may lie the remnants of a land we have forgotten. Not forgotten in the way of misplaced keys or faded photographs, but forgotten in the deeper sense, the way a dream dissolves upon waking, leaving only the faintest impression that something vast and significant once filled the mind. This is the story of Lemuria, a continent that may never have existed in the geological record, yet has never ceased to exist in the human imagination. It is a tale that begins not with ancient texts or mythological heroes, but with something far smaller and more unassuming. It begins with the lemur. In the middle decades of the 19th century, the natural sciences were experiencing a revolution of understanding. Charles Darwin had published his transformative work on the origin of species, and naturalists across Europe were engaged in the monumental task of cataloging, classifying, and explaining the bewildering diversity of life on Earth. Every new fossil unearthed, every specimen collected from distant lands, added another piece to a puzzle whose full picture remained tantalizingly unclear. Among the many mysteries that occupied these Victorian scholars, one stood out as particularly perplexing. It concerned the distribution of certain animals across the globe, and the question it posed seemed to defy all logical explanation. The lemurs were at the heart of this enigma. These peculiar primates, with their large reflective eyes and fox-like faces, were found primarily on the island of Madagascar, that great landmass lying off the eastern coast of Africa. Yet, fossil evidence of lemurs and their close relatives appeared not only in Madagascar, but also in the distant subcontinent of India. And traces of similar creatures had been identified in the Malay archipelago of Southeast Asia. How could this be? How could animals so closely related be separated by thousands of miles of open ocean? The Indian Ocean stretched vast and impassable between these lands, and lemurs were not creatures of the sea. They could not have swum such distances, nor could they have rafted across on floating vegetation for such immense journeys. The problem extended beyond lemurs. Naturalists were discovering that many species of plants and animals showed similar puzzling distributions. Certain fossils appeared on continents separated by great expanses of water, as if the organisms had somehow teleported across the globe. The geological and biological sciences of the time had no mechanism to explain such phenomena. The Earth was believed to be largely static, its continents fixed in their positions since the planet's formation. Mountains might rise and erode, seas might advance and retreat, but the fundamental arrangement of land and water was thought to be eternal and unchanging. It was into this atmosphere of intellectual ferment that an English zoologist named Philip Lutley Sclater introduced a bold hypothesis. Sclater was a respected figure in Victorian natural history, serving as secretary of the Zoological Society of London and editing its prestigious journal. In 1864, he published a paper that would give birth to a legend, examining the distribution of lemurs and related primates. Sclater proposed that there must once have existed a great landmass connecting Madagascar to India. This continent, he suggested, had subsequently sunk beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean, leaving only its former highlands as the islands we see today. He named this hypothetical sunken land Lemuria, after the creatures whose distribution had first suggested its existence. The idea was not as fantastical as it might seem to modern ears. The concept of land rising and falling, of coastlines advancing and retreating, was well established in 19th century geology. Scientists knew that much of Europe had once lain beneath shallow seas, as evidenced by marine fossils found far inland. If land could rise from the ocean, surely it could also sink beneath it. Sclater was not proposing magic or myth, but a sober scientific hypothesis to explain observed phenomena. Lemuria was, in his conception, simply a piece of geological history that happened to have disappeared beneath the waves. Other scientists of the era found the idea compelling. The German biologist Ernst Haeckel, a passionate advocate for Darwin's theory of evolution, embraced the Lemurian hypothesis with particular enthusiasm. Celts saw in Lemuria not merely an explanation for animal distribution, but a potential answer to one of the greatest questions in natural history, the origin of humanity itself. In his influential work, The History of Creation, Haeckel proposed that Lemuria might have been the cradle of the human species. He argued that the earliest human ancestors could have evolved on this lost continent, later spreading to Africa, Asia, and beyond as Lemuria slowly foundered beneath the sea. This was a remarkable claim, and Haeckel made it with characteristic boldness. He even went so far as to draw hypothetical maps showing Lemuria stretching from Madagascar to Southeast Asia, a great tropical landmass where the first proto-humans might have walked beneath primeval forests. The idea captured the imagination of the scientific community and the public alike. Here was a lost world, a sunken Eden where humanity itself might have taken its first tentative steps. The appeal was irresistible. Yet, even as Lemuria gained acceptance as a working hypothesis, the very foundations of the theory were beginning to show cracks. Other naturalists proposed alternative explanations for the peculiar distribution of species across the Indian Ocean region. Some suggested that ocean currents might have carried animals on natural rafts of vegetation. Others pointed to the possibility of ancient land bridges that had eroded away over millions of years without necessarily implying a vast, sunken continent. The fossil record, as it expanded, sometimes supported the Lemurian hypothesis and sometimes contradicted it. The fundamental problem was that no one had ever seen Lemuria or found direct evidence of its existence. It remained entirely hypothetical, a logical inference drawn from biological data rather than a geological fact confirmed by observation. The ocean floor of the Indian Ocean had not been surveyed in any meaningful way. No one knew what lay beneath those deep waters. Whether the drowned mountains of a former continent or simply the ancient basaltic crust of the oceanic depths, Lemuria existed, in scientific terms, as an elegant solution to a difficult problem, but a solution that could be neither proven nor disproven with the technology of the time. Its ambiguity would prove to be both the theory's weakness and its strange strength. For while the scientific hypothesis of Lemuria would eventually be superseded by better explanations, the idea of the lost continent would take on a life of its own. Freed from the constraints of empirical verification, Lemuria would drift from the realm of science into the far stranger territories of mysticism, occultism, and spiritual speculation. The land that zoologists had imagined to explain the distribution of lemurs would become the legendary homeland of ancient races, the cradle of forgotten wisdom and the symbol of a golden age lost to the waters of time. But in those early years of the hypothesis, such developments lay in the future. For Sclater and his contemporaries, Lemuria was simply a scientific proposition, a reasonable inference from the available evidence. The lemurs of Madagascar and their fossil relatives in India demanded an explanation, and a sunken continent provided one. The theory was discussed in the same measured tones used for any other geological or biological hypothesis. Papers were written, debates were held, and the scientific community considered the evidence with appropriate skepticism and rigor. What made Lemuria different from other scientific hypotheses? What gave it the power to transcend its origins and become something far greater was the nature of the claim itself. Sunken continent is not like a new species of beetle or an unusual rock formation. It carries with it the weight of worlds. To speak of a lost landmass is to speak of lost histories, lost peoples, lost possibilities. The mind cannot help but populate such a place with inhabitants, cannot help but wonder what civilizations might have risen and fallen on those now submerged shores. The scientific hypothesis of Lemuria was precise and limited, but the imaginative possibilities it opened were vast and boundless. The Victorian era was particularly receptive to such imaginings. This was an age of exploration and discovery, when the blank spaces on the map were rapidly being filled in. Every year brought news of new lands visited, new peoples encountered, new wonders revealed. Yet, even as the known world expanded, a curious nostalgia grew for the unknown. The more that was discovered, the more people seemed to long for mystery. Lost continents offered that mystery. They promised that somewhere, beneath the waves or beyond the horizon, there remained secrets yet to be uncovered, worlds yet to be found. Lemuria also spoke to deeper anxieties of the age. The theory of evolution had displaced humanity from its special position in creation, revealing us to be merely one branch on a vast tree of life, cousins to the apes, and ultimately to all living things. For many Victorians, this was a troubling revelation, one that seemed to diminish human dignity and cosmic significance. The idea of a lost continent where humanity might have originated offered a kind of consolation. It restored mystery to human origins, suggested that our beginnings might be grander and stranger than mere descent from ape-like ancestors, and hinted that there was more to the human story than the fossil record revealed. The oceans themselves contributed to the allure of the theory. The sea has always been a realm of mystery, its depths as inaccessible to human exploration as the surface of distant planets. In the 19th century, the deep ocean was virtually unknown. The technology to survey the seafloor, to send instruments and eventually humans into the abyss did not yet exist. The waters of the Indian Ocean could indeed have concealed a sunken continent. For all anyone knew, the mystery was genuine, the possibility real. Hey, and where genuine mystery exists, the imagination flourishes. As the decades passed, the scientific hypothesis of Lemuria would be refined, challenged, and eventually replaced by better explanations. But by then, the idea had escaped the laboratory and the lecture hall. It had entered the realm of popular imagination, where it would undergo transformations its scientific originators could never have anticipated. The continent that Philip Sclater had proposed to explain the distribution of lemurs was about to become something far more extraordinary. It was about to become a lost paradise, a spiritual homeland, and a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest hopes and fears about its own origins and destiny. The story of Lemuria is thus not simply a story about science or pseudoscience, about fact or fiction. It is a story about the human need to imagine lost worlds and golden ages, about our longing to believe that somewhere, somewhen, there existed a better place than the one we know. It is a story about how a reasonable scientific hypothesis can transform into enduring myth, and about what such myths reveal about the minds that create and sustain them. As we follow the tale of this lost continent through its many transformations, we are really following a thread that leads deep into the labyrinth of human imagination, where the boundaries between the real and the imagined grow thin and uncertain. The lemurs of Madagascar continue to peer out from their forests with their great golden eyes, unaware that they once inspired a legend. The waters of the Indian Ocean continue their eternal motion, keeping their secrets. And the idea of Lemuria continues to drift through human culture, a ghost continent haunting the edges of our maps and our minds. Whether it ever existed in geological fact is a question science has largely answered. Whether it exists in some other sense, some deeper sense, is a question that science alone cannot address. That is a question for each listener to contemplate as the waves of this story wash gently against the shores of sleep. The night is long, and there is much more to tell. The zoologists and naturalists who first proposed Lemuria would soon find their sober hypothesis taken up by minds with very different purposes. The lost continent was about to become a stage for cosmic dramas, a homeland for mysterious races, and a touchstone for seekers of hidden wisdom. The transformation from science to mysticism would be swift and strange, and it would ensure that Lemuria, whatever its geological reality, would never be forgotten. But that transformation belongs to the next chapter of this tale, waiting beyond the next breath, the next gentle wave of words washing over the listening mind. For now, let the image of that hypothetical continent settle into the imagination. Picture it as Sclater and Haeckel might have pictured it, a vast tropical landmass stretching across the Indian Ocean. Its shores lined with primeval forests, its interior alive with creatures now found only as fossils or as remnant populations on scattered islands. The lemurs moved through the trees in the gathering dusk, their calls echoing across valleys that would one day lie beneath miles of water. The sun sets over a world that existed, if it existed at all, in an unimaginably distant past. This is where the story begins. This is the first glimpse of Lemuria, seen through the eyes of 19th century science, a place proposed to solve a puzzle and destined to become so much more. The journey ahead will take us from these measured scientific beginnings into realms of mysticism and magic. From the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, from ancient history to modern spirituality. It is a long journey, but there is no hurry. The night stretches out before us, deep and full of dreams. The lost continent waits beneath the waves of memory and imagination, patient as the ocean itself. Let the waters close gently over the first chapter of this tale. Let the mind drift on the currents of the story, carried toward deeper waters and stranger shores. Lemuria is calling from the depths, a voice from a world that may never have been, yet has never ceased to be. Listen and follow as the night carries us onward into the mystery. The transition from scientific hypothesis to spiritual legend did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, like the slow submersion of a coastline beneath rising waters, till what had begun as a zoological proposition found itself transformed into something its originators would scarcely have recognized. The story of how Lemuria crossed from the realm of natural science into the territory of the mystical and occult is itself a fascinating journey. One that reveals much about the intellectual and spiritual currents of the late 19th century. It is a story of minds seeking meaning in a universe that science seemed to be draining of wonder, and finding in a hypothetical sunken continent a vessel for hopes and visions that transcended the material world. Ernst Haeckel had already pushed the Lemurian hypothesis beyond its original boundaries when he proposed the lost continent as the cradle of humanity. This was speculation, certainly, but it remained within the broad framework of evolutionary science. Haeckel was attempting to solve a genuine puzzle about human origins using the intellectual tools available to him. He drew his maps and made his arguments in the language of biology and geology. Even if his conclusions ventured into territory that could not be verified, the continent, he imagined, was still fundamentally a physical place, subject to the laws of nature, differing from other land masses only in having sunk beneath the sea. But the late Victorian era was a time of tremendous spiritual ferment. The certainties of traditional religion had been shaken by scientific discoveries. Yet many people found the purely materialist worldview offered by science to be spiritually unsatisfying. Into this void rushed a remarkable variety of new religious and philosophical movements, each promising to reconcile the findings of science with the human need for transcendent meaning. Spiritualism, with its seances and mediums, offered apparent evidence for the survival of consciousness after death. Various forms of occultism promised access to hidden knowledge and secret powers, and from this fertile ground emerged one of the most influential esoteric movements of the modern age, the Theosophical Society. Founded in New York in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott, the Theosophical Society would reshape the story of Lemuria in ways that continue to echo through spiritual and New Age movements to this day. Blavatsky was a remarkable figure, a Russian aristocrat who had traveled widely and claimed to have studied with hidden masters in Tibet. She was charismatic, controversial, and possessed of a sweeping vision that drew together elements from Eastern religions, Western occultism, and contemporary science into a vast synthesis she called Theosophy, meaning divine wisdom. in her monumental works, particularly Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. Blavatsky presented a cosmic history of humanity that stretched back millions of years and encompassed multiple continents and races that mainstream science knew nothing of. According to her teachings, received from the mysterious Mahatmas or masters who guided human spiritual evolution from their hidden retreats, humanity had passed through several great phases or root races, each associated with a particular continent and a particular stage of spiritual development. And among these root races, one of the most significant had flourished on the lost continent of Lemuria. Blavatsky took the scientific hypothesis she found in the works of Sclater and Haeckel and transformed it utterly. Her Lemuria was not merely a sunken landmass that happened to have hosted early primates. It was a continent of cosmic significance, the home of the third root race, beings who were in many ways unlike modern humans. According to Theosophical teaching, the Lemurians were gigantic in stature, standing as tall as the trees of the primeval forests. They possessed a third eye located in the back of the head, which gave them psychic and spiritual perceptions that modern humanity has lost. They were more closely connected to the spiritual planes of existence than we are, living in a state of consciousness that we can barely imagine. The geography of Blavatsky's Lemuria was equally expansive, rather than a relatively modest landmass in the Indian Ocean. The Theosophical Lemuria was a vast continent stretching across much of what is now the Pacific Ocean, extending from Madagascar in the west to Easter Island in the east, and from the Himalayas in the north to Antarctica in the south. This was a world continent dwarfing any landmass that exists today, and it had been home to a civilization that lasted for millions of years before meeting its catastrophic end. The appeal of this vision to Victorian seekers is not difficult to understand. Here was a history that restored magic and meaning to the world, that revealed humanity not as a recent arrival evolved from apes, but as a cosmic being with a spiritual destiny stretching back through inconceivable ages. The Lemurians were our ancestors, not merely in a physical sense, but in a spiritual one. Their third eye, though now atrophied and hidden within the skull as the pineal gland, still existed within us, a vestige of perceptions we had lost but might someday regain. We were not fallen apes, but fallen angels, descended from beings of greater stature and spiritual power. Blavatsky's system also offered an explanation for the diversity of human races that, while thoroughly outdated and problematic by modern standards, seemed to make sense of the world as Victorians understood it. The different human races, in her schema, represented different stages of spiritual evolution, remnants of earlier root races at varying degrees of development. This was a hierarchical vision that reflected the prejudices of its time, placing European civilization at the pinnacle of current human achievement, while assigning other peoples to lower rungs on the evolutionary ladder. The Theosophical movement would later attempt to distance itself from these racial hierarchies, but they were deeply embedded in the original teachings. What made Blavatsky's vision so powerful, however, was not its racial theories, but its sense of cosmic drama. The story she told was one of tremendous spiritual significance, a tale of ascent and descent, of powers gained and lost, of catastrophes survived and wisdom preserved. Lemuria had not simply sunk beneath the waves through geological processes. It had been destroyed in a series of tremendous cataclysms, divine punishments for the spiritual decline of its inhabitants. As the Lemurians fell from their original state of grace, as they became more materialistic and lost touch with their spiritual nature, the continent itself was torn apart. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, floods and fires gradually reduced the vast landmass to scattered islands. The survivors, diminished in stature and spiritual power, became the ancestors of certain modern human populations. This narrative of rise and fall, of a golden age followed by decline and catastrophe, is one of the oldest and most powerful patterns in human storytelling. We find it in the biblical tale of Eden and the fall, in the Greek myth of the ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, in countless traditions around the world that speak of a time when humans lived in harmony with the gods and with nature. Blavatsky was tapping into something deep in the human psyche, a persistent intuition that things were once better than they are now, that we have lost something precious, that the world we inhabit is somehow diminished from what it once was. The Theosophical version of Lemuria also served as a bridge between East and West. Blavatsky drew heavily on Hindu and Buddhist concepts, presenting them in a form that Western audiences could comprehend and embrace. The idea of root races evolving through great cycles of time echoed the Hindu concept of the yugas, the vast ages through which the universe passes in eternal repetition. The notion of hidden masters preserving ancient wisdom resonated with traditions of secret teachings passed down through initiatic lineages. For Westerners seeking alternatives to the Christianity of their upbringing, Theosophy offered an exotic and appealing synthesis. Kant, presenting Eastern ideas in a framework that also incorporated Western science and occultism. The influence of Theosophy on subsequent spiritual movements can hardly be overstated. From the Theosophical Society emerged or were influenced by such diverse groups as Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, Alice Bailey's Arcane School, the I Am movement, and countless New Age teachings that continue to flourish today. And through all these channels, the Theosophical version of Lemuria has propagated and evolved, taking on new forms while retaining its essential character as a lost spiritual homeland, a place of power and wisdom that existed before recorded history. Not everyone within the Theosophical movement was content with Blavatsky's often vague and fragmentary descriptions of Lemuria. Some of her followers sought to elaborate and systematize the teachings, filling in details that Blavatsky had left unclear. Among the most influential of these was William Scott Tillett, British theosophist, who published The Story of Atlantis in 1896 and The Lost Lemuria in 1904. These works provided detailed maps of the lost continents at various stages of their history, along with elaborate descriptions of the physical appearance, social organization, and spiritual practices of their inhabitants. Tillett claimed that his information came from the Akashic records, a kind of cosmic memory bank said to contain the imprint of everything that has ever happened in the universe. Through clairvoyant investigation, he and other adepts could supposedly access these records and retrieve information about the distant past that no ordinary historical research could uncover. This was a remarkable claim, and it freed esoteric historians from the constraints of physical evidence. If the Akashic records contained the truth, then the absence of archaeological or geological evidence for Lemuria was simply irrelevant. The spiritual evidence was all that mattered. Tillett's Lemurians were even more fantastical than Blavatsky's. He described them as producing through a kind of budding process rather than sexual generation, at least in their earlier phases. They communicated through a form of thought transference rather than speech. Their civilization, while primitive by modern standards, possessed forms of power and knowledge that we have lost. They were connected to the elemental forces of nature in ways that seemed magical to us, able to control, weather, and manipulate matter through the power of will. The maps that accompanied Tillett's works showed Lemuria at its greatest extent, covering much of the southern hemisphere, a continent far larger than any that exists today. Subsequent maps traced its progressive destruction as portions broke away and sank beneath the sea. Australia, according to this schema, was a surviving fragment of Lemuria, as were various Pacific islands. The destruction was not instantaneous, but occurred over millions of years, giving the Lemurian race time to migrate and evolve before their homeland disappeared entirely. This elaborate mythology, presented with maps and illustrations that gave it a scientific appearance, proved enormously influential. It established a template for subsequent lost continent narratives, combining pseudo-scientific trappings with mystical content in a way that would be imitated countless times. The idea that clairvoyance could recover lost history, that spiritual investigation could trump physical evidence, became a cornerstone of esoteric thinking that persists to this day. Yet, even as these elaborate visions of Lemuria were being constructed, mainstream science was moving in an entirely different direction. The very geological discoveries that would eventually provide a satisfying explanation for species distribution across the Indian Ocean were already being made, though their full implications would not be understood for decades. The continents scientists were beginning to suspect might not be as fixed as everyone had assumed. The Earth itself might be far more dynamic than the Victorian worldview had imagined. But these scientific developments would take time to mature and gain acceptance. In the meantime, the Theosophical Lemuria flourished in the fertile soil of spiritual seeking. It offered answers to questions that science seemed incapable of addressing. Where did we come from? And what is our destiny? What is the meaning of human existence? Is there more to reality than what our physical senses can perceive? For those dissatisfied with materialist answers to these questions, Lemuria became a symbol of hope, a promise that the world contained more wonders than the skeptics knew. The transformation of Lemuria from scientific hypothesis to spiritual legend was now complete. What had begun as a zoologist's attempt to explain the distribution of lemurs had become a cosmic drama of spiritual evolution and catastrophic destruction. The lost continent had acquired inhabitants, history, and meaning far beyond anything Philip Sclater could have imagined when he first proposed the name. Lemuria had become a mirror in which seekers could glimpse their own hopes and fears, their longing for a lost golden age and their faith in a future spiritual renewal. The night deepens and the story continues to unfold. The Theosophical Lemuria would inspire countless variations and elaborations, each adding new layers to the legend. The physical characteristics of the Lemurians, their spiritual practices, their ultimate fate, all these would be explored in ever greater detail by subsequent writers and visionaries. The lost continent had become a canvas on which the human imagination could paint its grandest dreams and darkest fears. Let these images settle gently into the mind as sleep approaches. The giant Lemurians, with their third eyes open to spiritual realities. The vast continent stretching across ancient seas, the catastrophes that brought it all to ruin. These visions belong to a particular moment in history, a time when science and mysticism intermingled in strange and creative ways. They are not scientific truth, but they are human truth of a different kind, expressions of longings and intuitions that facts alone cannot satisfy. The waters of the Indian Ocean keep their own counsel, neither confirming nor denying the legends that have been woven around their depths. The journey through the story of Lemuria continues, carrying us ever deeper into the labyrinth of human imagination. There is much more to discover, stranger territories yet to explore. But for now, let the mind rest in the mystery, cradled by the gentle rhythm of waves that may or may not have lapped against Lemurian shores in some impossibly distant age. To understand the Lemurians as the esoteric tradition envisioned them, we must set aside everything we think we know about human history and human nature. We must enter a world where time stretches back not thousands, but millions of years, where consciousness takes forms utterly unlike our own, and where the very meaning of being human undergoes transformations so profound that the word itself seems inadequate. The Theosophical vision of the third root race, those beings who walked the ancient continent of Lemuria, is a portrait of humanity in its cosmic infancy, beings who were in some ways less than we are, and in other ways immeasurably more. According to the elaborate cosmology developed by Blavatsky and her successors, humanity has passed through 7 great phases of development, each associated with a particular continent and a particular state of consciousness. We are currently the 5th root race, associated primarily with Europe and the modern world. Before us came the 4th root race, the Atlanteans, whose continent also met a catastrophic end. And before the Atlanteans came the Lemurians, the 3rd root race, whose story reaches back into depths of time that staggered the imagination. The earliest Lemurians, in this schema, were barely physical at all. They existed in bodies that were more etheric than material, forms of condensed spiritual energy rather than flesh and bone. The process of incarnation, of spirit descending into matter, was still in its early stages. These primordial beings were enormous by our standards, towering entities whose exact dimensions varied in different accounts, but consistently reached heights of 50, 60, or even 100 feet. They moved through a world that was itself less solidified than ours, a planet still cooling from its fiery origins, where the boundaries between the elements were more fluid than they have since become. These early Lemurians did not reproduce as we do. Sexual differentiation had not yet occurred. Instead, they propagated through a process variously described as budding, fission, or extrusion, producing offspring from their own bodies without the union of male and female. This was not merely a biological difference, but a spiritual one. The division into sexes, which would come later, represented a fundamental change in the nature of consciousness, a fall from an original state of wholeness into the duality that characterizes human existence today. The third eye of the Lemurians was not merely a metaphor, but a functioning organ of perception. Located at the back of the head in the earliest members of the race, it later migrated inward as the race evolved and the physical body solidified. This I perceived not the physical world, but the spiritual dimensions that interpenetrated through this organ. The Lemurians were in constant contact with the divine hierarchies that guide cosmic evolution, receiving instruction and guidance from beings far more advanced than themselves. They did not need to develop science or philosophy as we understand these disciplines, for they had direct perception of the truths that we must laboriously discover through reason and experiment. Communication among these beings was likewise different from anything we know. They did not speak in words, but transmitted thoughts and feelings directly from mind to mind. Language, with all its possibilities for misunderstanding and deception, had not yet developed. There was a transparency to Lemurian consciousness that we have lost, an immediacy of communion that made the isolation we experience as modern individuals inconceivable. To be Lemurian was to be connected, to exist within a web of shared awareness that encompassed not only other Lemurians, but the spiritual beings who watched over their development. The civilization of Lemuria, if it can be called a civilization at all, was utterly unlike anything in recorded history. There were no cities as we would recognize them, no governments, no written records. The Lemurians lived in harmony with nature because they did not yet experience themselves as separate from nature. They were expressions of the living earth, as much a part of the landscape as the mountains and forests that surrounded them. Their needs were simple and were met by the abundance of their tropical paradise. They had no need for technology because they possessed powers that made technology unnecessary. The ability to work directly with the elemental forces of nature through the power of concentrated will. Yet, this idyllic picture was not to last. The esoteric tradition speaks of a gradual descent, a process by which the Lemurians became increasingly enmeshed in matter and increasingly separated from their spiritual origins. This was not entirely negative, for it was part of the great plan of cosmic evolution. Spirit must descend into matter in order to transform matter and ultimately to raise it back to spirit. The journey into density was necessary, but it was also perilous. As the Lemurians became more physical, they also became more susceptible to error, more capable of acting against the divine will that had previously guided them automatically. The development of sexual reproduction was a crucial turning point in this descent. According to Theosophical teaching, the separation into male and female occurred during the middle period of Lemurian development, fundamentally altering the nature of human experience. What had been whole was now divided. What had been self-sufficient now required another for completion. This division brought with it new possibilities and new dangers. The union of male and female could be a sacred act, a reflection of cosmic principles of polarity and complementarity. But it could also become a source of attachment, jealousy, and conflict. As the Lemurians became more thoroughly incarnated in physical bodies, their third eye began to lose its power. The organ that had connected them directly to spiritual reality gradually withdrew into the interior of the skull, becoming what modern anatomy knows as the pineal gland. The vivid perceptions of the divine world faded into dim intuitions and eventually into the complete spiritual blindness that characterizes most of modern humanity. What the Lemurians had known directly, we must now take on faith or laboriously rediscover through spiritual practice. The later Lemurians, those who lived in the final ages of the continent before its destruction, were thus beings in transition. They were no longer the ethereal giants of the earliest period, though they remained larger than modern humans. They had developed language and the beginnings of what might be called culture. Though it was a culture oriented toward spiritual realities rather than material achievements. They built no great monuments of stone, for they had no need to commemorate their deeds or propitiate their gods. Their achievements were internal rather than external, developments of consciousness rather than technology. Yet even as the race developed in certain ways, it was also declining in others. The connection to the divine hierarchies that had guided earlier generations was weakening. Individual will was emerging, and with it, the possibility of choosing wrongly. Some Lemurians, according to the tradition, began to misuse their remaining powers. They mated with beings of a lower order, producing monstrous offspring that troubled the later ages of the continent. They turned their spiritual faculties toward selfish ends, seeking power over others rather than union with the divine. These transgressions set in motion the forces that would ultimately destroy their homeland. The cataclysms that ended Lemuria were not merely geological events, but spiritual judgments. The continent did not sink simply because of natural processes, but because the civilization that inhabited it had fallen below the threshold necessary for its continued existence. Fire and water, the classic agents of divine punishment, were unleashed upon the land. Volcanoes erupted across the continent, burying cities beneath ash and lava. Earthquakes shattered the foundations of the land, causing vast areas to collapse into the sea. Floods swept across the remaining territories, drowning those who had survived the initial disasters. Yet, not all perished. The esoteric tradition insists that a remnant survived, guided by the divine hierarchies to places of safety where they could preserve what was valuable from the dying civilization and pass it on to future generations. These survivors carried with them the seeds of the next root race, the Atlanteans, who would build a very different kind of civilization on a very different continent. The lessons of Lemuria, both its achievements and its failures, were encoded in the spiritual inheritance that these survivors transmitted to their descendants. The influence of Lemuria did not end with its physical destruction. In the Theosophical view, the experiences of past root races are preserved in the collective unconscious of humanity, shaping our dreams, our myths, and our deepest intuitions. The longing for paradise that appears in so many cultures may be a distant memory of Lemurian unity with nature and spirit. The myth of giants who once walked the earth, found in traditions from the Bible to Greek mythology to indigenous legends around the world, may preserve a trace of the colossal early Lemurians. Even the widespread belief in a third eye or inner eye of spiritual vision may derive from actual Lemurian experience, filtered through millions of years of racial memory. The physical traces of Lemuria, according to these teachings, can still be found if one knows where to look. Certain indigenous peoples, particularly those of Australia, Madagascar, and parts of Africa, are said to be descendants of Lemurian survivors, preserving in their bodies and their cultures echoes of that ancient time. The curious statues of Easter Island, those great stone heads gazing eternally out to sea, are being interpreted as Lemurian monuments or as representations of Lemurian ancestors, the lemurs themselves, Tiets, those strange primates whose distribution first inspired the hypothesis of a lost continent, are sometimes said to be degenerate descendants of creatures that served the Lemurians in some capacity. Modern Theosophists and their intellectual descendants have continued to elaborate on these teachings, by adding details and refinements that would have been unfamiliar to Blavatsky herself. Some have claimed to recover specific information about Lemurian society through meditation, channeling, or other forms of psychic investigation. Stories have emerged of Lemurian crystals that preserve the wisdom of the ancient race, of Lemurian temples hidden in remote locations, of Lemurian souls reincarnating in the present day to help humanity through its current crisis. The legend has proven endlessly fertile, generating new variations and elaborations with each passing generation. Whether any of this corresponds to historical reality is a question that the esoteric tradition itself would frame differently than mainstream science. For those who accept the reality of the Akashic records and the validity of clairvoyant investigation, the absence of physical evidence is simply irrelevant. The truth of Lemuria is spiritual rather than material, accessible through inner development rather than archaeological excavation. The giant Lemurians with their third eyes and their direct communion with the divine may never have existed in the sense that dinosaurs existed, leaving bones to be discovered and catalogued. But they exist, in another sense, as archetypal images of human potential, as reminders of what we may have been and what we might yet become. This understanding of Lemuria as a spiritual rather than physical reality has allowed the legend to survive and flourish long after science abandoned the hypothesis of a sunken continent. The Lemurians have become denizens of the imagination, figures in a myth that addresses needs and longings that factual history cannot satisfy. They represent a state of being that we have lost but might recover, a unity with nature and spirit that civilization has fractured but not destroyed. In this sense, Lemuria is not behind us but before us, a destination rather than an origin, a goal of spiritual evolution rather than a fixed point in the past. The night continues its slow passage. And these visions of ancient Lemuria drift through the mind like clouds across a moonlit sky. Giants walking through primeval forests, their third eyes perceiving realities invisible to us, their minds joined in wordless communion. A world before the fall into separation, before the forgetting that has made us who we are. Whether memory or dream, history or myth, these images carry a strange power, speaking to something deep within us that recognizes them even if our waking minds dismiss them as fantasy. Let the breath slow and deepen as these contemplations settle into quietude. The Lemurians, whatever they were or were not, have given us a gift in the form of a story that addresses our deepest questions about origin and destiny. They stand at the threshold of human history, or perhaps outside history altogether, figures of mystery pointing toward mysteries still greater. The journey through their legend continues, carrying us toward other lands, other visions, other dreams of what humanity has been and might become. But for now, let the mind rest in the image of that ancient world, that lost continent cradled by warm seas under strange stars, home to beings who were our ancestors in spirit, if not in flesh. The lost continent refused to stay in one place, just as its supposed landmass had fragmented and scattered across the ancient seas. So too did the idea of Lemuria drift and divide, carried by currents of imagination to new locations and new forms. What had begun as a hypothesis about the Indian Ocean would find its most enduring home in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, merging with other legends of sunken lands until the boundaries between distinct traditions became impossible to trace. This migration of Lemuria from one ocean to another is itself a fascinating story, revealing how lost continent narratives evolve and adapt, cueing from each other and from the genuine mysteries of the regions they claim to explain. The Pacific Ocean had its own tradition of sunken lands, older than Lemuria and rooted in different sources, For centuries, European explorers and scholars had puzzled over the remarkable achievements of Pacific Island peoples. How had the Polynesians, with their relatively simple technology, managed to colonize islands scattered across millions of square miles of open ocean? How had the inhabitants of Easter Island carved and erected their enormous stone statues? What explained the sophisticated astronomical knowledge and navigational skills that Pacific Islanders demonstrably possessed to minds accustomed to thinking in terms of continental civilizations? Such achievements seem to require an explanation beyond the capabilities of small island societies. The idea that a great Pacific continent had once existed, providing a homeland for advanced civilization whose remnants now survived only as scattered island populations, had been proposed long before Sclater named Lemuria. Various scholars had suggested that the Pacific Islands might be the mountaintops of a drowned landmass, the survivors of a catastrophe that had swallowed a mighty empire. This hypothetical continent was sometimes called Mu, a name that would become inextricably entangled with Lemuria in ways that continue to cause confusion to this day. The figure most responsible for the Mu tradition was James Churchward, British-born writer who claimed to have discovered the secret history of the Pacific motherland through a remarkable series of adventures. According to Churchward, he had served as a young soldier in India during the 1870s, where he had befriended a high priest at a temple school. This priest had shown him a collection of ancient tablets written in a language that predated all known civilizations. With the priest's help, Churchward claimed to have deciphered these tablets, learning from them the history of Mu, the original homeland of humanity. Churchward spent decades developing and promoting this narrative, eventually publishing a series of books beginning with the lost continent of Mu in 1926. His version of the sunken Pacific land was presented not as Lemuria, but as Mu, a distinct continent with its own history and characteristics. Yet the similarities to Theosophical Lemuria were unmistakable. Mu, like Lemuria, had been a vast tropical paradise, home to an advanced civilization that had flourished for thousands of years before being destroyed by catastrophic geological events. The survivors of Mu's destruction had scattered across the globe, carrying with them fragments of their advanced knowledge and establishing the great civilizations of antiquity. Churchward's Mu stretched across the Pacific from Hawaii to the Mariana Islands, from Easter Island to Fiji. It had supported a population of 64 million people, ruled by a priest king called the Ra-Mu. The Muvians, as Churchward called them, developed sophisticated sciences and technologies, including methods of generating and transmitting energy that modern civilization has not rediscovered. They had built great cities with broad avenues and magnificent temples, living in a state of enlightenment and prosperity that ended only when the continent itself was torn apart by volcanic cataclysm and swallowed by the sea. The evidence Churchward cited for this remarkable history was various and creative. The knuckle tablets he claimed to have seen in India were never produced for independent examination and remain entirely unverified. He also pointed to stone tablets supposedly discovered in Mexico by a William Niven, which Churchward interpreted as records of Mu's religious and cosmological teachings. He found evidence of Mu in the architecture of ancient Egypt, in the symbols of Mesoamerican civilizations, in the legends of Pacific Island peoples, and in geological features across the world. To Churchward, the entire ancient world was a palimpsest beneath which the memory of Mu could be discerned by those with eyes to see. The relationship between Mu and Lemuria has never been entirely clear. Churchward himself sometimes used the terms interchangeably, while at other times insisting that Mu was a distinct and separate land. Some writers have attempted to reconcile the two by placing them in different time periods, with Lemuria as an older continent and Mu as a later Pacific civilization. Others have treated them as different names for the same hypothetical landmass, regional variations on a single underlying legend. The confusion is compounded by the fact that Theosophical writers had already begun relocating Lemuria to the Pacific before Churchward published his first book, said the two traditions were already merging by the time Mu entered popular consciousness. What is clear is that the Pacific location proved far more compelling for lost continent enthusiasts than the original Indian Ocean setting. The Pacific is the largest and deepest ocean on Earth, vast enough to conceal almost any secret. Its thousands of islands, scattered like stars across an immense blue sky, seem to invite speculation about submerged connections. The remarkable cultures of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, with their sophisticated navigation, their monumental architecture, and their rich mythologies, provided endless material for those seeking evidence of a lost motherland, and the genuine geological dynamism of the Pacific. The earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that regularly reshape its islands lent plausibility to narratives of catastrophic destruction. Easter Island became a particular focus of lost continent speculation. This tiny, isolated island, lying over 2,000 miles from the nearest continental coast, is home to nearly 900 massive stone statues, famous moai that have puzzled observers since Europeans first visited in 1722. How had the ancient Rapa Nui people carved, transported, and erected these enormous figures, some weighing over 80 tons? The mystery seemed to demand an extraordinary explanation, and a lost continent provided one. Perhaps Easter Island was a surviving fragment of Mu or Lemuria, a mountaintop that had escaped the general submersion. The Mui were remnants of a civilization far greater than what a small island population could have produced alone. Modern archaeology has provided convincing explanations for the Mui that do not require lost continents. The Rapa Nui developed ingenious techniques for moving the statues using wooden sledges, ropes, and organized labor. Their civilization flourished for centuries before collapsing due to environmental crantication and other factors well documented in the archaeological record. But the appeal of the lost continent explanation persists, in part because it is more romantic than the prosaic truth, and in part because it connects Easter Island to a larger cosmic narrative of human greatness and catastrophic loss. Similar dynamics have operated throughout the Pacific. The ruins of Nanmadol in Micronesia, a complex of artificial islands built from massive basalt blocks, have been cited as evidence of Lemurian or Muvian engineering. The stone structures of Tonga and Samoa, the navigational charts of the Marshall Islands, the astronomical alignments found in various Pacific sites, all have been incorporated into lost continent narratives. Each genuine mystery becomes a piece of evidence for the sunken motherland, each unexplained feature a window into a forgotten past. The Polynesian peoples themselves have rich traditions of lands lost to the sea, stories of islands swallowed by waves, of ancient homelands from which the ancestors came, are common throughout the Pacific. These traditions reflect genuine historical experiences, for the Pacific has indeed been shaped by rising and falling sea levels, volcanic eruptions that have destroyed islands, and migrations across vast oceanic distances. The lost continent enthusiasts have often interpreted these traditions as memories of Mu or Lemuria, reading into indigenous mythologies confirmation of their own theories. This appropriation of Polynesian culture has been controversial. Indigenous scholars and activists have objected to the way lost continent narratives erase the genuine achievements of Pacific peoples, attributing their accomplishments to vanished white or otherwise known indigenous civilizations. The implication that Polynesians could not have developed their remarkable cultures on their own, that they must have inherited them from some superior lost race, reflects colonial attitudes that persist in supposedly alternative historical theories. The lost continent, for all its romantic appeal, can serve as a vehicle for denying agency and achievement to living peoples. Yet, the allure of the Pacific Lemuria remains powerful. There is something deeply appealing about the image of a tropical paradise swallowed by the sea, of an advanced civilization whose wisdom has been almost but not entirely lost. The vastness of the Pacific invites such imaginings in a way that few other regions can. Standing on a Pacific beach, watching the endless waves roll in from horizons that seem to stretch to infinity. It is easy to believe that such waters could conceal entire worlds. The ocean keeps its secrets well. The migration of Lemuria from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific also reflects the changing geography of Western imagination. In the late 19th century, when the Lemurian hypothesis first emerged, the Indian Ocean was still a region of mystery and romance, associated with the ancient civilizations of India and the exotic wildlife of Madagascar. But as the 20th century progressed, the Pacific became the new frontier of the unknown, the site where lost civilizations and hidden mysteries might still be found. The relocation of Lemuria tracked this shift in cultural focus, following the currents of Western fascination toward new shores. The conflation of Lemuria with Mu created a composite legend more powerful than either tradition alone. The Theosophical cosmology, with its root races and spiritual evolution, merged with the church ward's more adventure story narrative of a lost Pacific empire. Elements from both traditions were freely mixed and matched by subsequent writers, creating a Lemuria Mu hybrid that could accommodate almost any speculation about ancient mysteries. This synthetic tradition proved remarkably resilient, adapting to new discoveries and new cultural contexts, while maintaining its essential character as a story of human greatness lost to the waters of time. The journey from Philip Sclater's modest zoological hypothesis to James Churchward's grandiose Pacific motherland traces a remarkable arc of imaginative elaboration. What began as an attempt to explain the distribution of lemurs became a cosmic drama spanning continents and ages. The scientific content was progressively stripped away, replaced by mystical revelations and unverifiable claims. Yet something of the original appeal remained. The sense that the world contains hidden depths, that the past conceals secrets that the future may yet reveal. As sleep approaches and the mind drifts on quieter waters, let these specific visions float gently at the edges of awareness. The great stone faces of Easter Island, gazing eternally toward horizons that may once have shown the shores of a greater land. The scattered islands of Polynesia, fragments perhaps of a unity that existed before memory. The blue depths of the ocean, keeping their counsel, neither confirming nor denying the legends that have been cast upon them. The story of Lemuria in the Pacific is a story of human longing projected onto the largest canvas Earth provides. The ocean that covers more than a third of the planet's surface becomes a screen for dreams of lost greatness, a mirror reflecting our hopes and fears about the past and future of our kind. Whether Mu ever existed, whether Lemuria ever stretched across those tropical waters, our questions the ocean answers only with the eternal rhythm of its waves. But the questions themselves, and the human need that generates them, are as real as the tides. The night carries us onward, through waters both geographical and imaginal. There are still depths to explore, still mysteries to contemplate. The geological truth about Lemuria awaits discovery, the scientific explanation that would render the lost continent unnecessary as a hypothesis while doing nothing to diminish its power as a myth. But that revelation belongs to another stage of this journey. For now, let the Pacific dreams unfold in the gentle darkness, carrying the listening mind toward the distant shores of sleep. While mystics and adventurers were populating Lemuria with giant beings in ancient wisdom, the Earth itself was preparing to tell a different story. The 20th century would bring a revolution in our understanding of our planet, transformation so profound that it would render the very concept of a sunken continent scientifically impossible. Yet this revolution, like so many others, would unfold slowly, meeting resistance at every stage before finally achieving acceptance. The death of Lemuria as a scientific hypothesis is a story as fascinating as its birth, a tale of paradigm shifts and stubborn evidence, of ideas that seemed absurd until they became obvious. The problem that had originally inspired the Lemurian hypothesis, the puzzling distribution of species across the Indian Ocean region, had never gone away. Lemurs in Madagascar, fossil relatives in India, similar creatures scattered across Southeast Asia. As more fossils were discovered and more species cataloged, the patterns grew more complex, but no less mysterious. The land bridge hypothesis, of which Lemuria was one version, remained the dominant explanation well into the 20th century. Scientists continued to propose various sunken connections between continents, attempting to explain why animals and plants on opposite sides of vast oceans seemed to be related. But there was always something unsatisfying about these explanations. Land bridges and sunken continents were invoked freely whenever the distribution of species seemed to require them, creating a patchwork of hypothetical lands that had conveniently disappeared beneath the waves. The ocean floors remained largely unexplored, so there was no way to directly test these hypotheses. It was all inference and speculation, educated guessing based on biological evidence that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The first serious challenge to the lost continent paradigm came from an unexpected direction. In 1912, a German meteorologist and polar explorer named Alfred Wegener proposed a radical alternative. What if the continents themselves had moved? What if the landmasses we see today had once been joined together in different configurations, slowly drifting apart over millions of years? Wegener called his theory continental drift, a cane, and it would eventually transform our understanding of Earth and render Lemuria obsolete. Wegener had noticed what many others had observed before him, that the coastlines of Africa and South America seemed to fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. But he went further than idle speculation. He assembled evidence from multiple fields, geology, paleontology, climatology, to argue that the continents had once formed a single supercontinent he called Pangaea. This ancient landmass had begun breaking apart some 200 million years ago, its fragments slowly separating and drifting to their current positions. The Atlantic Ocean had opened as the Americas pulled away from Europe and Africa. India had broken free from a southern landmass and drifted northward to collide with Asia, throwing up the Himalayas in the process. If Wegener was right, then the distribution of lemurs and other species required no sunken continents to explain it. The animals had not crossed land bridges that subsequently sank. Instead, they had evolved when the continents were still connected and had been carried along as the landmasses separated. Madagascar had not been linked to India by a vanished Lemuria. Rather, both had been part of a larger southern landmass that fragmented over geological time, till lemurs had not crossed the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean had opened beneath them. The implications were revolutionary, and the scientific establishment was not ready to accept them. Wegener's theory was met with skepticism and often outright hostility. The evidence he presented was compelling in its breadth, but not conclusive in its details. Most damaging of all, Wegener could not explain how the continents moved. Quote, what force could possibly push entire land masses across the surface of the Earth? The rocks of the ocean floor seemed far too rigid to allow such motion. Without a plausible mechanism, continental drift remained an elegant idea without scientific foundation. Wegener died in 1930 during an expedition to Greenland, his theory still unaccepted by mainstream geology. For decades afterward, continental drift remained controversial, championed by a minority of scientists, while the majority continued to think in terms of fixed continents and sunken land bridges. Lemuria, though increasingly unfashionable, was not yet scientifically dead. The hypothesis lingered in geological literature, a terrient, one possible explanation among several for biogeographical puzzles that remained unsolved. The breakthrough came in the 1950s and 1960s, driven by new technologies that allowed scientists to explore the ocean floor as never before. Sonar mapping revealed the Miocene ridges, vast underwater mountain ranges running down the centers of the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Studies of magnetism in ocean floor rocks showed a remarkable pattern. Symmetric stripes of alternating magnetic polarity extending outward from the ridges on both sides. Most significantly, The rocks of the ocean floor proved to be remarkably young, nowhere more than about 200 million years old, while continental rocks could be billions of years old. These discoveries pointed to a startling conclusion. The ocean floors were not ancient and permanent, but young and dynamic. New oceanic crust was being created at the mid-ocean ridges, where molten rock welled up from the Earth's interior, solidified and spread outward in both directions. As new crust formed at the ridges, old crust was being destroyed elsewhere, diving back into the mantle at deep ocean trenches. The entire ocean floor was in constant motion, a vast conveyor belt carrying the continents along as passengers on tectonic plates. This was the mechanism Jenner had lacked. Continental drift was reborn as plate tectonics, now supported by coherent physical explanation and abundant evidence. 8. The Earth's outer shell was divided into a dozen or so major plates, plus numerous smaller ones, all in slow but constant motion relative to each other. Where plates collided, mountains rose, and earthquakes struck. Where they pulled apart, new ocean formed. The continents were not fixed but mobile, their current positions merely a snapshot in an ongoing dance that had lasted for billions of years. Plate tectonics explained the distribution of species without requiring any sunken continents. Madagascar, India, Australia, and Antarctica had all been part of a great southern supercontinent called Gondwana, which had itself been part of the even larger Pangaea. When Gondwana began to fragment around 180 million years ago, the ancestors of lemurs and many other species were distributed across its connected landmasses. As the fragments drifted apart, populations were isolated on separate continents, evolving independently into the distinct but related forms we see today. The lemurs of Madagascar and their relatives in the Indian fossil record were not evidence of a sunken land bridge, but of a time when no ocean separated their ancestors. The implications for Lemuria were fatal. The hypothesis had been proposed to explain biological patterns that plate tectonics now explained far more elegantly. More than that, plate tectonics made a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean physically impossible. Continental crust is fundamentally different from oceanic crust, less dense and thicker, riding higher on the underlying mantle. Continents do not sink. They may fragment, they may drift, they may collide and merge, but they do not simply plunge beneath the waves. The ocean floors that sonar mapping revealed showed no trace of drowned continental crust in the Indian Ocean, no remnant of the landmass that Sclater had proposed and Blavatsky had elaborated into cosmic myth. The death of Lemuria as a scientific hypothesis was remarkably quiet. There were no dramatic announcements, no formal refutations. The ideas simply became obsolete, replaced by a better explanation that made it unnecessary. By the 1970s, plate tectonics had achieved near universal acceptance in the geological community. Lemuria disappeared from serious scientific discussion, remembered only as a historical curiosity. An example of how scientists had once reasoned in the absence of crucial information about how the Earth actually works. Yet, the scientific death of Lemuria did nothing to diminish its cultural life. The lost continent had long since escaped the laboratory and taken up residence in the realm of myth and mysticism. For those who believed in Theosophical cosmology or church word-specific motherland, the pronouncements of geologists were simply irrelevant. Lemuria existed in a different register of reality, accessible through spiritual insight rather than scientific investigation. The Akashic records cared nothing for plate tectonics. The hidden masters who had revealed Lemuria to Blavatsky were not troubled by magnetic anomalies in ocean floor basalt. This divergence between scientific and mystical understandings of Lemuria continues to the present day. Geologists know with considerable certainty that no continent ever sank in the Indian or Pacific Ocean. The evidence from plate tectonics, from ocean floor mapping, from the physics of crustal buoyancy is overwhelming and consistent. Lemuria is not merely unproven, but impossible, given what we now understand about how the Earth works. Yet books about Lemuria continue to be published. Websites devoted to its mysteries continue to attract visitors, and spiritual seekers continue to feel connections to the lost motherland that science has declared never existed. This persistence raises interesting questions about the relationship between scientific truth and human meaning. Lemuria was always more than a geological hypothesis. From the moment Haeckel proposed it as the cradle of humanity, it carried emotional and philosophical weight that transcended its scientific content. The lost continent became a symbol for something deep in the human psyche, a longing for origins, for lost perfection, for a time before the fall. Science can demonstrate that this symbol has no geographical referent, but it cannot thereby eliminate the longing that the symbol expresses. The Gondwana supercontinent that plate tectonics revealed is in many ways more remarkable than Lemuria ever was. A vast landmass incorporating South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica, existing for hundreds of millions of years before fragmenting into the continents we know today. Gondwana was real, its existence confirmed by multiple lines of evidence. Its history traceable in the rocks and fossils of 5 continents. Yet, Gondwana has never captured the popular imagination the way Lemuria has. It lacks the romance, the mystery, the promise of lost wisdom and forgotten greatness. It is merely true, and truth alone does not always satisfy the human heart. As the night deepens and these geological histories settle into the mind, consider what has been lost and what has been gained. The Lemuria of scientific hypothesis is gone, replaced by an understanding of Earth far more dynamic and wonderful than the static world the Victorians imagined. Continents drift across the face of the planet like slow ships on an unimaginably patient sea. Oceans open and close over hundreds of millions of years. Mountain ranges rise where landmasses collide and erode away again in the fullness of time. The Earth is alive in ways that make a mere sunken continent seem almost mundane by comparison. Yet, the Lemuria of imagination endures, immune to geological refutation. It persists because it speaks to needs that science does not address, longings that factual accuracy cannot satisfy. The lost continent floats in a different ocean, a sea of dreams and symbols where the tides are driven by forces older than any tectonic plate. This Lemuria will never be found by sonar or sampled by deep-sea drilling. It exists in the spaces between facts and the human need to believe that somewhere, somewhen, there was a better world than this one. The waters close over the geological chapter of this story, but the journey continues. Lemuria, scientifically impossible, yet culturally immortal, awaits exploration in other dimensions. There are underwater discoveries to consider, actual submerged places that feed the hunger for lost lands. There are cultural memories to examine, traditions of drowned homelands that predate any European hypothesis. The lost continent has many faces, many forms, many meanings, yet to unfold. Let the mind drift now on these vast scales of time, the millions of years across which continents have danced their slow dance. The lemurs still move through the forests of Madagascar, descendants of ancestors who rode a fragment of Gondwana across the widening Indian Ocean. They know nothing of the theories their distribution has inspired, the continents, both real and imagined, that bear their name. They live in the present, which is the only place that life ever truly lives. Perhaps there is wisdom in that, a lesson from creatures far older than any human civilization, real or legendary, up here. The night carries us forward, through waters both literal and metaphorical. The lost continent has been found and lost again, proposed by science and dissolved by science, yet still it persists in the depths of human imagination. What does this persistence mean? What does it tell us about ourselves, about our needs and fears and hopes? These questions will guide the remaining journey as as we explore the echoes of Lemuria in underwater discoveries, in cultural memories, in spiritual movements that have made the lost continent their home. Sleep approaches on gentle waves, but the story is far from over. The ocean keeps its secrets reluctantly, surrendering them only to those with the technology and persistence to probe its depths. In the decades since plate tectonics rendered Lemuria scientifically obsolete, a new generation of discoveries has emerged from beneath the waves. Findings that have rekindled speculation about lost civilizations, even as they have complicated simple narratives of sunken continents. These underwater discoveries do not prove that Lemuria existed, but they demonstrate that the relationship between land and sea is more dynamic than casual observation suggests, and that genuine mysteries still lurk in the depths, waiting to be understood. The most straightforward of these discoveries concern the effects of Ice Age sea level changes. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, so much of Earth's water was locked in massive ice sheets that global sea levels dropped by approximately 120 meters. Coastlines extended far beyond their present positions. Lands that are now submerged were then dry and habitable. Human beings lived on these now drowned territories, leaving behind traces of their presence that underwater archaeologists are only beginning to explore. Sunland is perhaps the most dramatic example of this phenomenon. During the Ice Age, the shallow seas between the islands of Indonesia did not exist. Instead, a vast landmass connected Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula into a single territory larger than India. Human populations lived across this region, developing cultures and technologies adapted to its tropical forests and river systems. When the ice melted and the seas rose, Sunland was progressively drowned, its inhabitants forced to retreat to higher ground or adapt to increasingly maritime ways of life. The islands of Indonesia are the remnants of this once great land. The highlands that remained above water as the lowlands disappeared. Sundaland is not Lemuria. It was not a continent in the geological sense, merely a region of continental shelf exposed by low sea levels. It did not sink due to geological catastrophe, but was gradually inundated as climate changed and ice melted. Its inhabitants were not giants with third eyes or members of a spiritually advanced root race. They were ordinary humans, ancestors of the peoples who live in Southeast Asia today. Yet, the story of Sundaland echoes the Lemurian myth in haunting ways. Here was a real land, now lost beneath the sea, where human civilization once flourished. The myth may be false in its specifics, but the underlying intuition that lands have been lost to rising waters is entirely correct. Similar stories can be told of other regions. The Persian Gulf was largely dry land during the Ice Age, a river valley fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, and other streams that now flow into the sea. The North Sea between Britain and continental Europe was a habitable territory called Doggerland, home to Mesolithic hunter-gatherers whose tools and traces occasionally turn up in fishing nets. The Black Sea may have experienced a catastrophic flooding event around 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus and poured into what had been a smaller freshwater lake. Some researchers have suggested that this event might have inspired flood myths, including the biblical story of Noah. These genuine inundations provide a factual basis for the persistent human intuition that lands have been lost to the sea. Every culture that lives near coastlines has witnessed the power of water to claim territory, whether through tsunamis, storm surges, or the slow encroachment of erosion. The idea that entire civilizations might have been swallowed by the waves is not inherently absurd. It has happened repeatedly throughout human history. The question is whether the specific claims of Lemuria enthusiasts are supported by evidence, or whether they merely exploit the general truth that seas rise and lands flood. Some underwater discoveries have attracted particular attention from those seeking evidence of lost civilizations. The Gulf of Kamhat, off the western coast of India has been the site of controversial findings that some have interpreted as remnants of a drowned city. Sonar surveys in the early 2000s revealed geometric patterns on the seafloor that researchers initially suggested might be the remains of an urban settlement dating back 9,000 years or more. If confirmed, such a discovery would revolutionize our understanding of ancient Indian civilization, pushing its origins back thousands of years before the earliest known cities. However, the Gulf of Kamhat findings remained highly disputed. Subsequent investigations have raised serious questions about the initial interpretations. The geometric patterns might be natural geological formations rather than artificial structures. Artifacts reportedly retrieved from the site have been difficult to date reliably and may have been transported by currents from elsewhere. The scientific consensus remains skeptical, though proponents continue to argue for the site's significance. For Lemuria enthusiasts, the Gulf of Kamhat has become a tantalizing suggestion that ancient civilizations existed in the region. Perhaps the very civilizations that Theosophical tradition associates with the lost continent. Even more controversial is the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater rock formation off the coast of Japan's westernmost island, discovered in 1987 by a diving instructor. The Yonaguni structure features terraces, steps, and flat surfaces that some observers have interpreted as evidence of human construction. If the Yonaguni Monument is artificial, it would suggest the existence of an advanced civilization in the region during the Ice Age, when lower sea levels would have left the structure above water. The implications would be profound, overturning conventional timelines of human cultural development. The debate over Yonaguni has been fierce and is far from resolved. Geologists have pointed out that the rock formations can be explained by natural processes, particularly the tendency of the local sandstone to fracture along straight lines and flat plains. Similar formations exist above water on Yonaguni itself and on other islands in the region. The steps and terraces that seem so artificial may simply be the result of differential erosion acting on layered sedimentary rock. Yet the structure continues to attract divers and researchers who believe it bears the marks of human hands, and it features prominently in discussions of lost Pacific civilizations. What these underwater discoveries share is ambiguity. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. Natural processes can create formations that appear artificial to untrained eyes. The dating of submerged sites is difficult, and the interpretation of sonar data requires expertise that is not universally available. It is easy to see what one wants to see in the murky depths, to interpret shadows and shapes as confirmation of beliefs already held. The ocean, which hides so much, also invites projection, allowing observers to find in its depths whatever they are seeking. This ambiguity serves an important psychological function for those who believe in lost civilizations. As long as the evidence remains inconclusive, the dream remains alive. A definitive discovery would either confirm the believer's faith or shatter it forever. But ongoing uncertainty allows the search to continue indefinitely, the hope to persist undimmed. The underwater world becomes a repository for possibilities, a place where Lemuria might still be found, where the next dive or the next sonar survey might reveal the temples and cities of the lost motherland. Psychology of underwater discovery is worth contemplating. There is something uniquely compelling about the idea of submerged ruins, cities sleeping beneath the waves, waiting to be awakened by the explorer's gaze. Water preserves, even as it conceals. The sea is both grave and guardian, destroying civilizations while potentially preserving their remains in conditions that dry land cannot match. The fantasies that gather around underwater archaeology tap into deep wells of human imagination, the same wells that feed dreams of sunken Atlantis and lost Lemuria. Real underwater archaeology has made remarkable discoveries that require no appeal to lost continents. The wrecks of ancient ships, from Bronze Age traders to Spanish galleons, have been located and excavated, revealing treasures of historical knowledge. Submerged harbors and coastal settlements from Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and other civilizations have been studied, their remains illuminating the maritime dimensions of ancient life. These genuine discoveries demonstrate that the underwater world is rich with historical evidence, even if that evidence does not confirm the existence of Lemuria. Perhaps the most important lesson from underwater archaeology is that the truth is often stranger and more interesting than the myths it replaces. The real story of human adaptation to rising seas, of coastal civilizations lost to geological and climatic changes, of our ancestors' remarkable maritime capabilities, is a story worth telling. It does not require giants with third eyes or spiritually advanced root races. It requires only ordinary humans facing the challenges of a changing world with ingenuity and resilience, leaving traces of their passage that we are only now learning to read. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface, and the vast majority of the seafloor remains unexplored. There are certainly discoveries yet to be made, secrets yet to be surrendered by the deep. But the nature of those discoveries is likely to be different from what Lemuria enthusiasts hope to find. The ocean will reveal evidence of human activity during periods of lower sea level, traces of coastal settlements now drowned, perhaps even cultures and traditions not yet documented in the historical record. It will not reveal the remains of a sunken continent for the simple reason that continents do not sink. Yet the search will continue, driven by hopes that transcend scientific evidence. For those who believe in Lemuria, every ambiguous sonar return, every suggestive underwater formation, every artifact dredged from the seafloor becomes potential confirmation of their faith. The ocean's very inscrutability sustains the dream. As long as vast expanses of the deep remain unexplored, Lemuria might still be waiting to be found. The possibility, however, remote from a scientific perspective, is enough to keep the vision alive. As the night deepens and these underwater visions drift through the mind, consider the strange commerce between fact and fantasy that characterizes human engagement with the unknown. The ocean is real, its depths genuine, its mysteries authentic. But the meanings we attach to those depths, the lost worlds we imagine beneath the waves, are products of our own needs and longings. We find in the sea what we bring to it, seeing reflections of our hopes in waters that merely reflect the light. The drowned lands of the Ice Age are real, and their story is being slowly recovered by patient scientific investigation. The great civilizations that rose and fell along ancient coastlines left traces that underwater archaeologists are learning to interpret. The relationship between humanity and the sea is ancient and complex, marked by both conquest and catastrophe, adaptation and loss. This is a story rich enough to fill many nights with wonder, requiring no embellishment from mythical continents or legendary races. Yet, Lemuria persists in imagination, undimmed by scientific refutation, feeding on ambiguity and the eternal human hope that somewhere beneath the waves lies evidence of a golden age. The lost continent has become less a geographical claim than a symbol, a way of expressing intuitions about human origins and destiny that factual geography cannot capture. In the echoes of genuine underwater discoveries, Lemuria finds new life, adapting to each new finding, incorporating each ambiguous piece of evidence into its ever-expanding mythology. The waters close gently over these reflections, as they close over all things in time. What lies beneath the waves, we cannot know until we look. What we find when we look depends partly on what is there and partly on what we expect to see. The conversation between discovery and dream is endless, each shaping the other in ways that blur the boundaries between the real and the imagined. In that blurring, Lemuria lives on, neither fully real nor entirely false, a ghost continent haunting the edges of the possible. Sleep approaches on tides of mystery. The ocean breathes its ancient breath, rising and falling as it has since before there were eyes to see or minds to wonder. Somewhere in the depths, real and imagined, the lost worlds wait. Not Lemuria, as the Theosophists envisioned it, perhaps, but something, always something. The sea is too vast, too old, too full of secrets to have yielded all its treasures to human knowing. In that inexhaustibility lies the persistent appeal of lost continent dreams. The sense that no matter how much we discover, there is always more to find. Long before European scientists proposed a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean, the peoples who lived along its shores told stories of lands lost to the sea. These traditions, preserved in ancient literature and oral memory, speak of catastrophic floods, of kingdoms swallowed by waves, of ancestral homelands now lying beneath the waters. When the Lemurian hypothesis arrived in the late 19th century, it encountered these indigenous traditions and became entangled with them in complex ways. The result was a fusion of Western pseudoscience and Eastern cultural memory that continues to shape how millions of people understand their own origins and history. Nowhere is this fusion more evident than in the Tamil-speaking regions of southern India and Sri Lanka. The Tamil people possess one of the oldest continuous literary traditions in the world, with texts dating back more than 2,000 years. Within this vast literature are references to a land called Kumari Kandam, a territory said to have existed south of the present Indian subcontinent before being consumed by the sea. The story of Kumari Kandam has become inseparable from the story of Lemuria, the two traditions merging into a single narrative of Tamil origins that carries profound cultural and political significance. The earliest references to lost lands in Tamil literature appear in the commentaries on the Sangam poetry, the classical corpus of Tamil verse dating roughly from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the 3rd century of the Common Era. These commentaries, written centuries after the poems themselves, describe 3 successive Sangam academies, gatherings of poets and scholars patronized by the Pandyan kings, according to tradition. The first 2 academies were located in cities that were subsequently destroyed by the sea, their literary treasures lost forever. Only the 3rd academy survived, its works forming the Sangam literature that we possess today. The lands lost to the sea in these traditions are described in terms that suggest genuine cultural memory of coastal flooding. The Indian subcontinent has indeed experienced significant changes in coastline over the millennia, with archaeological evidence of submerged settlements along the Tamil Nadu coast. The city of Pumpur, mentioned in classical Tamil literature as a thriving port, now lies partially underwater, its remains visible to divers. The Gulf of Mannar and the Palk, strait between India and Sri Lanka, are shallow waters that would have been dry land during periods of lower sea level. The Tamil traditions of lost lands may preserve memories of actual inundations, transformed by centuries of retelling into legends of vanished kingdoms and drowned academies. When the Theosophical Society established its international headquarters in Adyar, near Chennai, in 1882, it brought the Lemurian hypothesis directly into contact with Tamil cultural traditions. The Theosophists were deeply interested in Indian religions and philosophies, and they found in the Tamil legends of Kumari Kandam apparent confirmation of their own teachings about a lost southern continent. A synthesis was natural and perhaps inevitable. Lemuria, the continent proposed by Western scientists and elaborated by Western occultists, became identified with Kumari Kandam, the lost homeland of Tamil tradition. The two were declared to be the same place, viewed through different cultural lenses. This identification had profound implications. If Kumari Kandam was Lemuria, then Tamil civilization was not merely ancient, but primordial. The direct heir of the original human culture, Tamil language, already revered as one of the oldest living languages, became the descendant of the original tongue spoken by the Lemurians. Tamil spirituality, with its rich traditions of devotion to Shiva and the goddess, was revealed as the survival of Lemurian religion. The Tamil people were not simply an ethnic group with a distinguished history, but the guardians of humanity's oldest heritage, the living link to the lost motherland. This vision proved enormously appealing, killingly during the late colonial period when Indian intellectuals were seeking to assert the value and antiquity of their own civilizations against British claims of cultural superiority. The Lemurian Kumari Kandam synthesis offered Tamil speakers a past that exceeded anything Europe could claim. A civilization older than Egypt or Mesopotamia, a culture that had flourished when the ancestors of Europeans were still primitive savages. The lost continent became a tool of cultural pride and resistance. It's a way of reclaiming dignity in the face of colonial condescension. The development of Dravidian politics in the 20th century gave new impetus to Lemurian Tamil nationalism. The Dravidian movement, which sought to distinguish South Indian identity from the Sanskrit-based culture of the North, found in Kumari Kandam evidence of an independent Tamil civilization predating the arrival of Aryan peoples in India. The lost continent became politically charged, a symbol of Tamil antiquity and autonomy. Politicians and cultural figures invoked Lemuria in speeches and writings, presenting it not as a fringe theory, but as established historical fact that mainstream scholarship had suppressed or ignored. This political dimension complicates any discussion of Lemuria in the Tamil context. To dismiss the lost continent as mere pseudoscience is to risk appearing to dismiss Tamil cultural pride itself, to side with colonial and northern Indian perspectives that have historically marginalized Tamil achievements. Yet, to accept the Lemurian hypothesis uncritically is to embrace claims that have no scientific foundation, to substitute mythology for history in ways that ultimately serve no one's interests. The challenge is to honor the genuine antiquity and achievements of Tamil civilization while maintaining intellectual honesty about what the evidence actually supports. The Tamil literary traditions do preserve genuine cultural memory of coastal changes and possibly of catastrophic flooding events. The archaeology of the Tamil coast reveals a rich history of maritime trade and cultural exchange stretching back thousands of years. The Sangam literature itself, whatever one makes of the legends about earlier lost academies, is a remarkable achievement that requires no hypothetical continent to explain. Tamil civilization is genuinely ancient and genuinely distinguished. Its contributions to literature, philosophy, architecture, and religion forming an integral part of human heritage. None of this depends on the existence of Lemuria. Yet, the Lemurian mythology persists, propagated through popular books, websites, and cultural organizations that present the lost continent as historical fact. Maps showing the extent of Kumari Kandam circulate widely, depicting a landmass stretching from Madagascar to Australia with Tamil Nadu at its heart. Claims are made about the scientific achievements of the Lemurians, their advanced technology, their spiritual wisdom, all of which supposedly survive in encoded form in Tamil traditions. The line between cultural pride and pseudo-historical fantasy has become thoroughly blurred. Similar dynamics have played out in other regions where indigenous traditions of lost lands have intersected with Lemurian mythology, in parts of Indonesia and Malaysia. Creation myths involving floods and submerged territories have been interpreted through the Lemurian lens. In Australia, some have attempted to connect Aboriginal traditions to the lost continent, suggesting that the indigenous peoples of the continent are descendants of Lemurians who survived the cataclysm. These interpretations typically say more about the interpreters than about the traditions they claim to explain, posing Western esoteric frameworks onto indigenous cultures in ways that can be both presumptuous and harmful. The appropriation of indigenous traditions by lost continent enthusiasts raises serious ethical questions. When Western or Western-influenced writers claim that the achievements of non-European peoples must be explained by appeal, to a lost, advanced civilization, they implicitly deny those peoples the credit for their own accomplishments. The same dynamic that attributes the Easter Island statues to Lemurians rather than Rapa Nui operates when Tamil achievements are credited to a hypothetical prehistoric supercivilization rather than to the Tamil people themselves. The lost continent, however romantically it is portrayed, can function as a form of cultural erasure. Yet, it must also be acknowledged that the Lemurian narrative has been actively embraced by many within the communities it purports to describe. Tamil intellectuals and cultural nationalists have not simply had Lemuria imposed upon them, but have actively adopted and developed the concept for their own purposes. The fusion of Kumari, Kandam, and Lemuria represents a creative synthesis, a way of making sense of ancient traditions in light of modern concepts and concerns. To dismiss this synthesis entirely is to deny agency to those who have found meaning in it, to treat them as passive victims of Western pseudoscience rather than active participants in the construction of their own cultural narratives. The situation calls for nuance and sensitivity. The scientific case against Lemuria is overwhelming, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging this. Continental-scale landmasses do not sink, and no geological evidence supports the existence of a drowned continent in the Indian Ocean. The Tamil traditions of Kumari Kandam may preserve memories of real coastal changes, but these were regional phenomena, not the destruction of a Pacific-spanning motherland. The equation of Kumari Kandam with Lemuria, however culturally significant, is not historically accurate. At the same time, the human needs that the Lemurian Tamil synthesis addresses are real and important. The desire for distinguished ancestry, the longing for a golden age, the wish to believe that one's culture preserves ancient wisdom. These are universal human impulses that deserve respect, even when the specific forms they take are factually unfounded. The challenge is to find ways of honoring these needs that do not require belief in geological impossibilities, to celebrate the genuine achievements of Tamil and other civilizations without resorting to pseudo-historical inflation. As the night carries these reflections toward the shores of sleep, let the complexity of the situation settle gently into awareness. Lemuria, in the Tamil context, is not simply true or false, but is something more intricate, a weaving together of science and spirituality, of colonial history and anti-colonial resistance, of genuine cultural memory and wishful elaboration. The lost continent has become a mirror reflecting the desires and struggles of those who have adopted it, a symbol whose meaning far exceeds its literal content. The waters of the Indian Ocean continue their endless motion, indifferent to the legends that have been projected upon their depths. The Tamil people continue their lives, heirs to a civilization that needs no hypothetical continent to validate its worth. The traditions of Kumari Kandam continue to be told, carrying forward memories whose exact nature we may never fully understand. And Lemuria continues to float in imagination, adapting to each new context, taking on colors and meanings that its original proposers never anticipated. The story of Lemuria in Tamil Nadu is ultimately a story about how ideas travel and transform, how scientific hypotheses become spiritual symbols, how ancient traditions merge with modern theories to create something new. It is a story about cultural memory and cultural invention, about the ways that peoples construct their pasts to meet the needs of their presents. Whatever one concludes about the factual status of the lost continent, this human dimension of the story remains endlessly fascinating, a window into the creative workings of the meaning-making mind. Sleep approaches, and with it, the permission to hold contradictions gently, to let the factual and the mythical coexist in the spacious awareness of the dreaming mind. The lost lands of Tamil tradition, whether they correspond to geological realities or not, are real in the ways that matter most to those who cherish them. Here, they are real as cultural inheritance, as sources of identity and pride, as links to ancestors whose exact circumstances may be forgotten, but whose legacy endures. In that sense, Kumari Kandam lives on, not beneath the waves, but in the hearts and minds of those who remember. The lost continent found an unlikely second home, among the snow-capped peaks of Northern California. Mount Shasta, a dormant volcano rising over 14,000 feet above the Cascade Range, has become the center of a distinctly American Lemurian tradition. A place where the survivors of the sunken motherland are said to dwell to this day. The story of how a hypothetical landmass in the Indian Ocean came to be associated with a mountain in the American West is a strange chapter in the already strange history of Lemuria, revealing the remarkable adaptability of lost continent mythology and its capacity to root itself in new landscapes and new cultural contexts. Mount Shasta had long been regarded as sacred by the indigenous peoples of the region, including the Shasta, Wintu, and Modoc tribes. Their traditions spoke of the mountain as a place of power, the dwelling of spirits, and the site of important ceremonies. When European Americans arrived in the 19th century, they brought their own sense of the mountain's numinous quality. There was something about Shasta that invited mystical interpretation, something in its isolated grandeur and its crown of eternal snow that suggested the presence of forces beyond ordinary understanding. The first significant connection between Mount Shasta and lost civilizations appeared in 1894, with the publication of a curious novel titled A Dweller on Two Planets. The book was attributed to a young Californian named Frederick Spencer Oliver, who claimed to have received its contents through automatic writing from a spirit called Philos the Tibetan. The narrative described the history of Atlantis and its connection to a hidden realm existing beneath and within Mount Shasta, where survivors of the ancient catastrophe continued to live in a state of advanced spiritual and technological development. Oliver's book did not specifically mention Lemuria, focusing instead on Atlantis, but it established Mount Shasta as a site of occult significance, a place where the remnants of lost civilizations might survive undetected by ordinary humanity. The mountain became part of the American esoteric landscape, joining other power spots and sacred sites in a geography of the hidden. Seekers began to visit Shasta with new eyes, looking not just at its physical beauty, but searching for signs of the secret inhabitants that Oliver's channeled text had described. The explicit connection to Lemuria came in the 1930s, through the writings of Wishart Spinell Serve, a pseudonym of Harvey Spencer Lewis, the founder of the ancient mystical order Rosicrucis, known more commonly as AMORC. In his 1931 book, Lemuria, The Lost Continent of the Pacific, Lewis presented a detailed account of Lemurian civilization and its destruction, drawing on theosophical sources while adding his own elaborations. Crucially, Lewis claimed that survivors of Lemuria had established a colony on Mount Shasta, where their descendants continued to live in hidden caverns within the mountain, occasionally emerging to interact with the outside world. Lewis's Lemurians were described in terms that would become standard in the Mount Shasta tradition. They were tall, graceful beings with elongated features and an aura of spiritual refinement. Attaining possessed advanced technology, including methods of generating power that mainstream science had not discovered. They wore white robes and communicated through a combination of speech and telepathy. They were benevolent but secretive, generally avoiding contact with ordinary humans while working behind the scenes to guide human evolution toward higher states of consciousness. The timing of Lewis's book was significant. The early 1930s were a period of economic devastation and social uncertainty, the depths of the Great Depression. Americans were hungry for hope, for evidence that the world contained more than the grim realities of unemployment and poverty. The idea that an advanced civilization existed hidden within an American mountain, preserving ancient wisdom and working for humanity's benefit, offered a kind of consolation. If the Lemurians were real, then the visible world was not all there was. Help was available from unseen sources, and the current troubles were merely a passing phase in a longer spiritual evolution. The Mount Shasta Lemurian tradition grew through the mid-20th century, fueled by reported sightings and encounters. People claimed to have seen strange lights on the mountain. Tall, robed figures appearing and disappearing, unusual aircraft emerging from hidden entrances. These reports accumulated into a body of lore that gave the tradition an experiential dimension. One did not have to accept the claims of channeled texts or occult authorities. One could potentially encounter the Lemurians directly, see them with one's own eyes, receive their wisdom face to face. The stories that emerged from Mount Shasta shared certain common features. The Lemurians were always benevolent, always spiritually advanced, always possessed of knowledge that could benefit humanity if only we were ready to receive it. They lived in harmony with nature and with each other, having transcended the conflicts and limitations that plagued ordinary human society. Their technology was clean and sustainable, powered by forces that did not pollute or deplete. They represented, in essence, everything that modern civilization was not, a utopian contrast to the materialism and strife of the 20th century. This utopian quality is central to understanding the appeal of the Mount Shasta tradition. The Lemurians served as an ideal, a vision of what humanity could become if it followed a different path. They were not merely survivors of an ancient catastrophe, but harbingers of a possible future, demonstrating that advanced technology and spiritual wisdom could coexist, that civilization did not have to mean destruction and degradation. The hidden realm within the mountain was a seed of hope, a promise that the values it embodied could someday spread throughout the world. The New Age movement of the late 20th century embraced Mount Shasta wholeheartedly. Its interest in alternative spirituality exploded in the 1970s and 1980s. The mountain became a destination for seekers from across the country and around the world. Retreat centers and spiritual communities sprang up in the surrounding area. Bookstores filled with titles about Lemurian wisdom and Shasta's mysteries. Workshops and conferences offered instruction in channeling, crystal healing, and other practices associated with the Lemurian legacy. The mountain became an industry as well as a sacred site. Crystal healing developed particularly strong connections to the Lemurian tradition. Certain types of quartz crystals, characterized by horizontal striations on their surfaces, came to be known as Lemurian seed crystals. According to New Age teaching, these crystals had been programmed by the ancient Lemurians with wisdom and healing energy, then planted in the earth to be discovered when humanity was ready to receive their gifts. The crystals were said to facilitate access to Lemurian consciousness, to carry encoded information that could be unlocked through meditation and intention. A market developed for these crystals, with specimens from Brazil and other locations commanding premium prices based on their supposed Lemurian provenance. Channeling became another major avenue for Lemurian teaching. Numerous individuals claimed to receive communications from Lemurian masters, ascended beings who had evolved beyond physical existence, but who continued to guide humanity from higher dimensions. These channeled messages offered spiritual instruction, predictions about Earth's future, and elaborations of Lemurian history and cosmology. Books of channeled material proliferated, each adding new details to the tradition, creating an ever-expanding body of Lemurian lore. The Lemurians channeled through Mount Shasta practitioners were notably different from the beings described in Theosophical literature. Blavatsky's Lemurians had been primitive by modern standards, spiritually significant, but lacking in technological sophistication. The Mount Shasta Lemurians, by contrast, were advanced in every way, possessing sciences and technologies that exceeded our own. This evolution reflected the changing concerns of the audiences these traditions addressed. Victorian Theosophists were interested in spiritual evolution and cosmic history. Late 20th century Americans wanted practical wisdom and solutions to contemporary problems. The Lemurians adapted to meet these needs. The Mount Shasta tradition also developed distinctly American characteristics. The emphasis on individual experience, on direct encounter with spiritual realities, rather than reliance on institutional authority, reflected American religious culture. The entrepreneurial dimension, the creation of businesses and services around Lemurian teaching, fit American patterns of commercialized spirituality. Even the geography was American. transplanting an Asian legend to North American soil, making it accessible to American seekers who might never travel to India or the Pacific Islands. Today, Mount Shasta remains a major center of alternative spirituality, and the Lemurian tradition remains central to its identity. Visitors come seeking healing, enlightenment, and contact with the hidden inhabitants of the mountain. Local businesses cater to their needs, offering crystals, books, guided tours, and spiritual services of every description. The town of Mount Shasta has embraced its reputation, balancing the interests of spiritual tourists with those of more conventional residents in an uneasy but generally functional coexistence. The mountain itself continues to inspire awe, regardless of one's beliefs about its hidden inhabitants. Its volcanic cone rises dramatically from the surrounding landscape, snow-covered for much of the year, often wreathed in clouds that add to its air of mystery. Those who climb its slopes or contemplate its profile from the valleys below can understand why it has attracted sacred associations, why it seems to invite stories of hidden realms and otherworldly beings. Some places simply feel significant, and Mount Shasta is one of them. Whether the Lemurians actually dwell within the mountain is a question that admits no definitive answer. No entrance to their hidden realm has been publicly documented. No Lemurian has submitted to scientific examination. The evidence for their existence consists entirely of personal testimonies, channeled messages, and the felt sense of those who believe. For skeptics, this absence of verifiable evidence is conclusive. For believers, it merely confirms that the Lemurians wish to remain hidden, revealing themselves only to those who are spiritually prepared to receive them. As sleep approaches and these images of the sacred mountain settle into the drowsy mind, let them rest gently without demanding resolution. Mount Shasta rises in the darkness, its nose gleaming faintly under starlight, its secrets intact. The Lemurians, if they exist, continue their hidden work, patient as the mountain itself. And the seekers continue to come, drawn by hopes and longings that no amount of skepticism can entirely extinguish. The American Lemuria is a strange and beautiful phenomenon, a transplanted mythology that has taken root in new soil and flourished in unexpected ways. It tells us something about the adaptability of sacred narratives, their capacity to travel and transform while retaining their essential appeal. It tells us something about American spirituality, its hunger for direct experience, and its entrepreneurial energy. It tells us something about the human need for hidden dimensions, for the sense that the visible world is not all there is. That somewhere just beyond ordinary perception lies a realm of wonder and wisdom. The night carries these reflections toward rest. The mountain stands in its eternal patience. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. And the story of Lemuria continues to unfold, finding new forms in each generation, adapting to each new landscape and each new set of human needs. Mount Shasta is but one chapter in this ongoing tale, a distinctly American chapter, but part of a larger narrative that spans continents and centuries. The lost motherland has found many homes since it first sank beneath the waves of imagination, and it will surely find more before its story is done. Why do we dream of sunken lands and fallen empires? What is it about the human mind that finds such persistent appeal in stories of lost civilizations? Golden ages vanished beneath the waves, wisdom once possessed and now forgotten. The story of Lemuria, traced through its many transformations from scientific hypothesis to spiritual symbol, ultimately leads to these deeper questions about human psychology and the needs that mythologies serve. To understand why Lemuria has endured despite its scientific impossibility is to understand something fundamental about how human beings make meaning in a world that often seems devoid of it. The idea of a golden age existing in the distant past appears in cultures around the world, suggesting that it arises from something deep in human nature rather than from any particular historical circumstance. The ancient Greeks spoke of a primordial age of gold, when humans lived without toil or sorrow, followed by progressively degraded ages of silver, bronze, and iron. Hindu cosmology describes vast cycles of time called yugas, with the current age, the Kali Yuga, representing the lowest point of spiritual and moral development. Biblical tradition places paradise at the beginning of human history, a garden of innocence from which we were expelled through our own failings. Everywhere we look, we find the sense that things were once better than they are now. This intuition of decline from an original perfection serves important psychological functions. It provides an explanation for the suffering and imperfection we experience in our lives, attributing them not to the fundamental nature of existence, but to a fall from a better state. If the world was once perfect and has become corrupted, then perfection is possible. The Golden Age is not merely a fantasy, but a memory, evidence that the ideal can be real. And if perfection existed in the past, perhaps it can be recovered in the future. The myth of the Golden Age is thus simultaneously an explanation of present suffering and a promise of possible redemption. Lemuria fits seamlessly into this archetypal pattern. The lost continent represents the Golden Age given geographical form, a place where the ideal once existed in concrete reality. The Lemurians, whether conceived as spiritually advanced Theosophical root races or as technologically sophisticated hidden masters, embody human potential fulfilled. They are what we could be, what we perhaps once were, what we might become again if we can recover what was lost. The sunken continent is not merely a piece of hypothetical geography, but a symbol of human possibility. A reminder that greatness lies within our nature, even if it has been obscured by the waters of time. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung devoted much of his career to understanding the symbolic patterns that recur across human cultures. Patterns, he believed, arose from what he called the collective unconscious, a shared psychic heritage underlying all human experience. Among these patterns, or archetypes, Jung identified the paradise archetype, the image of an original wholeness from which consciousness has become separated. This archetype manifests in creation myths, in dreams, in religious symbols, and in a persistent human longing for return to a state of unity and completion. From a Jungian perspective, Lemuria can be understood as a projection of the paradise archetype onto the external world. The lost continent represents not a literal geographical place, but a psychological state. The original wholeness of the psyche before it became fragmented through the development of individual consciousness. The catastrophe that sank Lemuria symbolizes the necessary but painful process of differentiation. The emergence of ego from the undifferentiated matrix of the unconscious, and the hope of recovering Lemurian wisdom represents the psychological task of integration, the reunion of conscious and unconscious into a more complete and balanced self. This psychological interpretation does not debunk Lemuria so much as deepen it. The lost continent may not exist on any map, but the longing it represents is entirely real. Kama beings genuinely do experience a sense of exile, a feeling of separation from something essential that we cannot quite name or remember. We genuinely do intuit that we are capable of more than our current condition reflects, that there is a wholeness available to us that ordinary life rarely achieves. Lemuria gives form to these intuitions, makes them concrete and narratable, transforms vague feelings into a story that can be told and shared. The appeal of lost continents also reflects the human relationship with the past itself. We are historical creatures, defined in large part by our memories and our sense of continuity with those who came before us. Yet the past is fundamentally inaccessible, separated from us by the irreversible flow of time. We can never truly know what our ancestors experienced, never fully recover the worlds they inhabited. This inaccessibility creates a kind of grief, a mourning for all that has been lost, all that can never be retrieved. Lost continent narratives give expression to this grief while also offering consolation. Yes, whole worlds have vanished, they acknowledge. Yes, civilizations have risen and fallen, leaving barely a trace. The impermanence of human achievement is real and sobering. But perhaps not everything was lost. Perhaps somewhere, in hidden libraries, or encoded crystals, or the Akashic records of cosmic memory, the wisdom of the ancients survives. Perhaps the past is not as inaccessible as it seems, and the treasures it contained are not gone forever, but merely waiting to be rediscovered. The specific form that lost continent beliefs take often reflects the particular anxieties of the era in which they flourish. 19th century Lemuria emerged in a context of colonial expansion and racial theorizing, and it carried the marks of those concerns and its hierarchies, case of root races, and its assumptions about civilization and savagery. The Mount Shasta Lemurians of the 20th century reflected anxieties about technology and environmental destruction, offering a vision of advanced science in harmony with nature. Contemporary Lemurian spirituality often emphasizes healing from trauma and recovering lost aspects of the self, mirroring therapeutic concerns dominant in current culture. This adaptability is part of what makes lost continent narratives so enduring. They are flexible enough to accommodate changing concerns while maintaining their essential structure. The Golden Age can be populated with whatever qualities the current age seems to lack. The catastrophe can be interpreted through whatever lens seems most relevant. The promise of recovery can be tailored to whatever form of salvation feels most urgent. Lemuria is less a fixed mythology than a template, story structure that can be filled with different content as needs and circumstances change. The persistence of belief in lost continents, despite overwhelming scientific evidence against their existence, raises interesting questions about the relationship between scientific and mythic modes of understanding. Science operates through evidence and reason, seeking to describe the world as it objectively is. Myth operates through symbol and narrative, seeking to express meaning and value that cannot be captured in purely factual terms. These two modes address different human needs and employ different criteria of truth. For those who believe in Lemuria, the scientific arguments against its existence may simply be irrelevant. They are not making claims about geology or plate tectonics. They are making claims about meaning, about identity, about the nature and destiny of consciousness. When they speak of the lost continent, they are using the language of myth to express truths that feel more fundamental than any facts about the Earth's crust. To respond with the geological evidence is to miss the point, to answer a question they are not asking. This is not to say that all claims are equally valid, or that evidence does not matter. Scientific inquiry has genuine authority within its domain, and the geological impossibility of sunken continents is not merely a matter of opinion, but it is to recognize that human beings live in multiple registers of meaning simultaneously, and that the scientific register, however important, does not exhaust the full range of human significance. The lost continent may be geologically false and psychologically true at the same time, a fiction that expresses something genuine about the human condition. The question of what to do with this recognition is not easily answered. Simply dismissing Lemuria believers as deluded fails to engage with the real needs their beliefs address. Yet, uncritically accepting pseudo-historical claims undermines the integrity of knowledge and can lead to harmful consequences. Perhaps the most constructive approach is to take the symbolic content seriously while maintaining honesty about the factual claims. To honor the longing for lost paradise without pretending that a literal paradise ever existed. As the night deepens and these psychological reflections settle into the quieting mind, let them rest without resolution. The human need for golden ages and lost homelands is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be understood. We are creatures who make meaning through story, who project our hopes and fears onto the screen of the cosmos, who dream of better worlds because we cannot help but sense that better is possible. Lemuria is one expression of this essential human tendency. neither the first nor the last, neither more nor less valid than countless other myths that have served similar functions throughout history. The lost continent floats in the darkness between waking and sleeping, between fact and dream, between the world as it is and the world as we wish it could be. It carries the weight of all our longings for wholeness and return, all our grief for what has been lost, all our hope for what might yet be found. To dismiss it is to dismiss something important about ourselves. To accept it literally is to confuse the symbol with what it symbolizes. Perhaps the wisest response is simply to let it be, to allow the myth to work upon the soul in its own way, trusting that the psyche knows what it needs, even when the conscious mind cannot articulate it. The ancestors who first told stories of drowned lands and golden ages did not need scientific verification for their tales. They needed meaning, and meaning is what the stories provided. We are their descendants, still telling similar stories, still seeking similar meanings, still dreaming of lost Edens and sunken Atlantises and mysterious Lemurias. The details change, but the structure remains, as persistent as the human heart itself. Sleep approaches on the wings of these ancient dreams. The lost continent waits in the depths of the unconscious, that inner ocean where all the archetypes swim. Perhaps tonight it will surface in some dream, taking whatever form the sleeping mind requires. Perhaps it will offer gifts, as it has offered them to dreamers throughout history. Or perhaps it will simply rest in its depths, felt but not seen, shaping consciousness from below as the moon shapes the tides. The story of Lemuria is not over, can never be over, as long as human beings continue to dream of better worlds and mourn for what has been lost. It is not a story about geology or history, but about the soul, about what we need and what we seek and what we hope to find. In that sense, the lost continent is more real than any geological formation, more enduring than any mountain or ocean. It exists in the place where all the deepest things exist, in the heart of human experience itself. The journey through the story of Lemuria has carried us across oceans, both geographical and imaginal, through territories of science and mysticism, through the depths of human psychology and the heights of spiritual aspiration. Now, as the night reaches its fullest darkness and sleep draws near, we arrive at the place where all such journeys must eventually come to rest, not at a conclusion, for the story of Lemuria has no true ending, but at a point of stillness from which the whole can be contemplated, a quiet harbor where the mind can settle before drifting into dreams. What has this journey revealed? At the most literal level, it has traced the history of an idea. Following the Lemurian hypothesis from its origins in 19th century zoology, through its elaboration in Theosophical mysticism, its migration to the Pacific and its conflation with Mu, its scientific death through plate tectonics, and its cultural immortality in traditions from Tamil Nadu to Mount Shasta. This history is intricate and fascinating, full of colorful characters and unexpected turns, a reminder that ideas have lives of their own, evolving and adapting in ways their originators could never anticipate. But beneath this surface narrative lies something deeper, something that the story of Lemuria illuminates without fully explaining. Human beings are creatures who cannot live by facts alone. We require meaning, purpose, sense that our existence connects to something larger than the immediate circumstances of our individual lives. We need stories that tell us where we came from and where we are going, that locate us in a cosmos that makes sense, that offer hope in the face of suffering and significance in the face of apparent meaninglessness. Lost continents and golden ages, however factually unfounded, serve these needs in ways that purely scientific accounts of reality do not. The tension between scientific truth and mythic truth runs through the entire Lemurian narrative. Science tells us that no continent ever sank in the Indian or Pacific Ocean, that the distribution of species is explained by plate tectonics, that the archaeological record contains no evidence of the advanced ancient civilizations that lost continent enthusiasts imagine. This scientific truth is important and should not be dismissed. It represents the best understanding we have of how the physical world actually works, achieved through centuries of careful observation and rigorous reasoning. Yet mythic truth operates by different criteria and serves different purposes. When someone speaks of Lemuria as a spiritual homeland, they are not making claims about geology. They are expressing a felt sense of connection to something ancient and significant. A longing for roots that go deeper than recorded history. An intuition that human consciousness has dimensions and potentials that modern life has forgotten or suppressed. To respond to such expressions with geological evidence is to miss the point entirely, to apply the wrong kind of truth to the wrong kind of claim. The question of how to hold these two kinds of truth together is one of the deepest challenges facing contemporary consciousness. We live in an age that privileges scientific knowledge, and for good reason. The power and precision of scientific understanding have transformed human life in ways both wonderful and terrible. We cannot and should not abandon the commitment to evidence and reason that science represents. Yet neither can we ignore the dimensions of human experience that science does not address. The needs for meaning and belonging and transcendence that factual knowledge alone cannot satisfy. Lemuria, in a strange and ambiguous way, holds this tension open without resolving it. The lost continent is neither simply true nor simply false. It is factually impossible and symbolically potent, geologically absurd and psychologically profound. It points to something real, even if that something is not a sunken landmass, but a permanent feature of human consciousness, the eternal longing for paradise that no amount of scientific progress will ever eliminate. Perhaps this is the deepest teaching that Lemuria offers, not any specific content about ancient civilizations or spiritual evolution, but the recognition that human beings inhabit multiple registers of reality simultaneously. We are physical creatures in a physical world, subject to the laws of nature that science describes. We are also meaning-making creatures in a world of symbols, stories, and significances that cannot be reduced to physics and chemistry. To deny either dimension is to truncate human experience, to lose access to something essential about what it means to be alive. The waters that supposedly closed over Lemuria are metaphors as much as they are geological impossibilities. We all know what it is to feel that something precious has been lost, that a world we once inhabited has become inaccessible, that memories and possibilities have slipped beneath the surface of awareness, never to return. We all carry within us drowned continents, territories of experience that have been submerged by the rising waters of time and change. Lemuria gives form to this universal experience, makes it visible and narratable, allows us to contemplate it, and perhaps to mourn it, and perhaps also to hope. For if lands can sink, perhaps they can also rise. If wisdom can be lost, perhaps it can be recovered. The Lemurian narrative, in all its variations, consistently offers this hope. The knowledge of the ancients is not gone forever, but preserved in hidden places, coded in crystals, or recorded in Akashic records, or transmitted through channeled messages from ascended masters. The fall from the Golden Age is not the end of the story, but a phase in a larger cycle, and the upward turn is always possible. This hope may be naive from a scientific perspective, but it addresses a genuine human need that scientific skepticism does nothing to eliminate. As sleep approaches and the conscious mind prepares to surrender its daytime concerns, let these reflections settle gently into the deeper layers of awareness. The lost continent awaits in the realm of dreams, where the boundaries between fact and fantasy dissolve, where the impossible becomes navigable, where the soul can visit territories that waking life cannot reach. Perhaps tonight, Lemuria will surface in some dream, offering its treasures to the sleeping mind, or perhaps it will remain submerged, felt as a presence beneath the threshold of awareness, shaping the dream landscape from below. The ocean that covers our planet is itself a kind of unconscious, vast and dark and full of life we cannot see. Its depths have been less explored than the surface of the moon, and it guards its secrets with the patience of geological time. Whatever Lemuria represents, whatever the lost continent symbolizes about human origins and possibilities, it shares something essential with the actual ocean. Both are realms of mystery, territories that exceed our capacity to fully know them, presences that humble the knowing mind even as they invite its exploration. The lemurs of Madagascar still move through their island forests, descendants of ancestors who lived when the world wore a different face. They know nothing of the theories their distribution inspired, the continents, both real and imagined, that bear their name. They live in the eternal present that all animals inhabit, untouched by the human preoccupation with past and future. There is something restful in contemplating their existence, a reminder that life continues its ancient patterns regardless of the stories we tell about it. The Tamil poets still sing of Kumari Kandam, keeping alive a tradition that connects the present to a past beyond memory. The seekers still climb Mount Shasta, looking for the hidden entrances to the Lemurian realm. The channelers still receive messages from ancient masters, and the dreamers still dream of sunken cities and forgotten wisdom. The story continues because it answers to something permanent in human nature, something that no amount of scientific progress or spiritual evolution will ever entirely transform. And so the night reaches its deepest point, the hour when the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes most permeable. The lost continent hovers at the edge of consciousness, neither fully present nor fully absent, like a memory that cannot quite be brought into focus. It has been with us throughout this long journey, this exploration of its many faces and meanings. Now it prepares to accompany us into sleep, to continue its work in the realm where all symbols come alive and speak their truths in the language of dreams. Let the waters close gently over the day's concerns. Let the mind sink into the depths where rest awaits. The lost continent is not lost at all, not really. It exists wherever human beings dream of better worlds and mourn for what is past. It rises whenever someone feels the pull of the ancient, the lure of the mysterious, the longing for a home that has never been seen but is somehow remembered. Lemuria is a state of consciousness as much as it is a geographical hypothesis. It's a mode of being in the world that values mystery and meaning alongside fact and reason. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, the same stars that shone over whatever lands existed in the inconceivably distant past. The ocean breathes its slow breath, rising and falling as it has since before there was life to notice. The earth turns on its axis, carrying us from darkness toward dawn, though dawn is still far off and sleep lies waiting in the interim. All these ancient rhythms continue regardless of human belief, indifferent to our stories, yet somehow reflected in them, as if the cosmos itself were dreaming and we were figures in its dream. Sleep now. Let the journey complete itself in the darkness. The lost continent has given what it has to give, not answers, but questions, not certainty, but wonder. It has reminded us that the world is stranger and more layered than everyday consciousness perceives, that beneath the surface of the known lies an ocean of mystery that no amount of exploration will ever fully chart. This is not a cause for despair, but for humility and awe, for the recognition that to be human is to live in the presence of depths we cannot fathom. Lemuria sinks once more beneath the waters of sleep, as it has sunk countless times before, as it will sink countless times again. But it does not disappear. It waits in the depths, patient as the ocean itself, ready to rise again when the dreaming mind calls it forth. The lost continent is never truly lost, for it exists in the only place where lost things can never be finally forgotten. In the heart of human imagination, in the soul that dreams of wholeness and remembers, however dimly, a home it has never ceased to seek. The night embraces all things In its vast darkness, the story ends, or rather pauses, for stories like this one have no true endings. Somewhere beyond the horizon of sleep, Lemuria waits. Somewhere in the depths of the dreaming mind, the golden age still shines. And somewhere, always, the human heart continues its ancient search for the paradise it knows must exist. The lost homeland, it has never stopped remembering, the continent of the soul that no ocean can ever truly drown. Rest now. The waters are calm. The lost land has told its story, and the story has done its work. What remains is silence, and the gentle motion of waves, and the peace that comes when seeking gives way to stillness. Lemuria is here, in this moment of surrender. It has always been here. It will always be here, as long as there are dreamers to dream it, and seekers to seek it, and hearts to remember what the mind has forgotten. The lost continent is found in the only place it ever truly existed. It is found in you, sleeping now, dreaming now, home at last in the depths of the infinite ocean.